Welcome. I'm very happy to be here today to present this talk. Is the Bible the basis of Western civilization? Feel free to ask questions anytime during the talk. Feel free to interrupt if I'm used to lecturing to students, and they raise their hands and they ask questions in the middle of talks, so it's not a problem. I'm a professor of international economics at Stockholm School of Economics, which is just a short distance from here. I teach at the bachelor level introductory course on international economics that all the students in the bachelor program are required to take. So everyone who has gone through the Stockholm School of Economics bachelor program has had me as a professor since the year 2000. And I also have been teaching for the last 5 years a course at the master level on international trade. And what I want to talk to you today is about a big discovery that I made in preparing to teach my master course on international trade. That is, I think, highly relevant for this audience. It's about the subject, is the Bible the basis of Western civilization? And in a more clear focus, it's about the issue, how do we teach this message in a secular academic environment? How do we bring up these issues in the secular academic world? How can we teach this material in a university setting? And hopefully this talk will stimulate thinking along those lines. Next slide. I start off with a quotation from a very influential economics textbook. It's by Professors Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. Darren Acemoglu is a star economics professor at MIT. James Robinson is a star political science professor at Harvard University, who has recently moved to University of Chicago. These are people that are at the top of their disciplines in economics and political science. They wrote this book, Why Nations Fail, published in 2012, and it became a bestseller. It's a book that a lot of economics students have read and have been impressed by. And at the Stockholm School of Economics, we actually invited one of these two people, James Robinson, to come and give a special lecture a few years ago called the Heckscher Lecture. And it was a remarkable event when he came. The lecture was held in the largest room that the school has, that seats around 400 people, and the room was packed. I've never seen as many people show up for the Heckscher Lecture at the Stockholm School of Economics. That's an indication of how influential the message is. What is the message in their book? The message is, it's basically institutions are really important for explaining the world we live in. Countries with high living standards have good institutions. Countries with low living standards have bad institutions. And in particular, what are good institutions? They are inclusive political institutions where a lot of people in a society get to participate in important decisions. That's the message in the book. Put simply, the message is democracy is really good, dictatorship is really bad. Okay, so far, so good. I think there's a lot of people that would agree with this message. But there's a secondary message in the book that is revealed in this quote, which really struck me when I read it the first time. Is the cultural hypothesis useful for understanding world inequality? You know, why some countries are rich and other countries are poor? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that social norms, which are related to culture, matter, and can be hard to change. And they also sometimes support institutional differences, this book's explanation for world inequality. But mostly no, because those aspects of culture often emphasized religion, national ethics, African or Latin values are just not important for understanding how we got here and why the inequalities of the world persist. I want to focus in on this part. Religion, just not important for how we got here. Just not important for explaining why some countries are rich and other countries are poor. When I read this, I was shocked and also curious. How did they succeed in showing this? And I studied their argument, and I can tell you today, they're wrong. And it was fun studying the issue and figuring out why they are wrong. So I want to present what is wrong with their empirical analysis. Next slide. In the book, Why Nations Fail, it's impossible to figure out whether their argument is true or false, because the whole book is storytelling based on the assumption that religion doesn't matter. So you can't really evaluate whether the evidence is convincing or not. They don't present the evidence. Instead, they have a footnote at the end of the book in which they say, we have shown this in the empirical work that they've done. And they cite this paper published back in 2001 in the American Economic Review, top economics journal. So I went back and I read this paper carefully. And after I finished reading the paper, I was still asking myself the question, where did they show that religion is not important? I was still puzzled about this. And so I decided I'd do a literature search. This paper has been published quite a long time ago, 2001. Let's see if anyone in the subsequent literature has criticized their empirical work. And I discovered someone has. Robert Woodbury wrote a paper published in 2012 in American Political Science Review, which is the very top political science journal in the world today, in which he levels an empirical critique of Acemoglu and Robinson's research that I think is devastating, and many people don't know about this. So part of today's talk is bringing these results to your attention. In words, this is what Woodbury shows. He shows that Protestant missions strongly predict democracy. Countries are more likely to have stable democratic institutions later in time. He looks at the period from 1950 to 1994. That have more Protestant missionaries earlier in time. And he looks at the period around 1920. So the basic message of the paper is more Protestant missionaries in a society earlier in time, that society later in time is more likely to have democratic institutions, stable democratic institutions. Precisely what Acemoglu and Robinson call the good institutions. You're more likely to get if there were more Protestant missionaries present earlier in time. And what are these Protestant missionaries doing? They are going to colonies and they are telling people about Jesus. They are telling people to read the Bible. They are teaching people to read the Bible. They are setting up elementary schools in which they teach basic literary skills. And they are going with the attitude, everyone needs to read the Bible for themselves. Everyone in society needs to be exposed to this message. So what Woodbury is showing is this has a big effect in promoting stable democratic institutions. This claim that religion just isn't important for shaping the world we live in given this result, that could only be true if democratic institutions just aren't important for shaping the world we live in. And I don't think anybody wants to go down that path intellectually. The other thing that Woodbury shows is looking at 140 countries, that's their sample. 50% of the variation in democracy is explained by the earlier presence of Protestant missionaries. This number right here, that is amazing. 50% of the variation in the data is explained by the Protestant missionaries. Wow. Looking at a huge number of countries, 140 countries. Next slide. I want to show you the evidence because it's just so striking. This should be taught in a lot of settings. I teach this at the Stockholm School of Economics. This could be taught in economics course, political science courses. This could be taught in high school in a simplified version. It's a message that people need to learn about. So let me explain the results. This table is presenting robust regression predicting democracy in the non-Western world. So the Woodbury is running regressions where the left-hand side variable, what you're trying to explain, is the mean level of democracy from 1950 to 1994. Why does he look at mean level of democracy? Because he doesn't want to pick up the idea a country has democratic institutions today, but then the next leader turns the country into a dictatorship. He wants to look at democracy that persists. Because obviously there are examples where it didn't persist. For example, Adolf Hitler was a democratically elected leader in Germany in 1933, and then he proceeds to turn democracy off. So we don't want to count Germany in 1933 as having democratic institutions. That's why he looks at mean level. So that's the left-hand side variable in the regression. Look at the first column. That's sort of the core empirical result in the paper, where he has three right-hand side variables, all of which are measuring missionary presence. So one is years exposed to Protestant missions. So how many years have Protestant missionaries been present in some colony? Protestant missionaries per 10,000 population in 1923. So looking at a particular year and just how many Protestant missionaries are present. Percent evangelized by 1900. It's picking up how much impact have these Protestant missionaries have. How many, what percentage of the population has heard the Christian message. This is a data set, 140 countries. It's basically all the countries in the world excluding the West. So excluding Europe, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Looking at the non-Western world, huge sample. Those are the results he gets. So what does he find? The coefficient on this variable, strictly positive. The 3 stars mean it's highly statistically significant. Statistically significant at the 1/10 of the 1% level. So very strong result. All of these are 3-star variables. So positive, positive, positive. This number means that in those colonies that are exposed to Protestant missions for more years, they're more likely to have stable democracy later in time. This being positive means for those colonies where there are more Protestant missionaries present in 1923, they're more likely to have stable democracy later in time. And here, more people evangelized by 1900. Positive number means more likely to have democracy later in time. It's really striking. I get excited about this. This is a fantastic discovery. And then the claim that this explains 50% of the variation in the data, that's the result down here. The R-square from robust regression, 0.498. Roughly 0.5. Roughly 50% of the variation in the data for democratic institutions is explained by earlier presence of Protestant missionaries. This is powerful evidence that the Bible is the basis of Western civilization, because it's the Bible that leads to the good institutions associated with the Western world. And nice thing about this is we can teach this in the secular academic world. This is why I get excited about this. I can teach this at the Stockholm School of Economics, where most students are not Christians. And they can't object, because this is science. This is evidence-based teaching. They might not like what they hear, but they don't have a legitimate complaint, which is great. Okay, let me show you the second column. Let me keep on going. The results get more amazing. Second column shrinks the sample size down to 57. The reason being that the key variable that's used in Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson's empirical work, the key variable, the settler mortality rate variable that they claim is a really important instrument for institutions. They only have data on this for a small set of countries, 57. So of these 140 countries, only 57 of them is their data on settler mortality rate. Key variable that Acemoglu and Robinson use in their empirical work. So when you shrink to the smaller sample size, the results get less strong. This is only statistically significant at the 10% level, but they're the same types of results. And it's not a criticism of Woodbury's research. Obviously, if you throw out a lot of data, the statistical results get weaker. We know from the full sample that the statistical results are really strong. So the weaker results here is not at all a criticism of Woodbury. It's a limitation of what Acemoglu and Robinson did. They don't have a large sample on this settler mortality rate variable. Anyway, the numbers are all positive, statistically significant at some level, and similar to here. In the third column, we add to the regression this fourth variable, settler mortality rate. And notice what happens. No significant changes here. These numbers, the Protestant missionary variables are basically the same, all positive, all statistically significant. Look at what happens here. This coefficient, it's almost 0. And the standard error is 5 times as large. This means it's statistically insignificant. Means this variable, settler mortality, it doesn't explain anything once you control for the Protestant missionaries. So this is a fundamental problem with Acemoglu and Robinson's empirical work. They're using this as an institution for institutions. It doesn't explain anything about institutions once you control for Protestant missionaries, which means the only reason why there's a correlation between this and this is operating through the activities of Protestant missionaries. They are, in their empirical work, they're only picking up the effects of Protestant missionaries, and then they're claiming that they're doing religion-free analysis. So it's a fundamental problem with what they're doing. Their analysis just falls apart under careful examination. Next slide.
You can ask one question.
Sure.
where it says something about being evangelized, or the missionaries that are talking about Jesus or so, but could it be explained also that the missionaries did more than just talking about Jesus? For example, schools and education, or maybe hospitals?
Yes, yes, good question. Could it, yeah, let's go back.
Repeat the...
Yeah, repeat. Could it be that it's the effects are not driven by Protestant missionaries telling people about Jesus, but rather the democracy promoting effects of the Protestant missionaries are just due to the fact that they're teaching people how to read. It's just pure human capital accumulation. It doesn't matter whether you read the Bible or the Communist Manifesto, you get democratic institutions. I don't buy it. I don't buy that story. And the easy way to see that there's something wrong in that story is just go to mainland China today. The Chinese certainly learned how to read a long time ago. They're rather good at reading. In fact, they're so good at reading, they are outperforming, Chinese high school students are outperforming Swedish high school students on the PISA tests in mathematics, science, and reading comprehension, and yet China has not got democratic institutions. It's a Communist Party dictatorship today, and it's not making any progress towards getting democratic institutions. So this idea that just pure human capital accumulation leads to democratic institutions, I just don't buy it. And it's not just China, it's, you know, there's a lot of countries in the world that are dictatorships where people know how to read.
Could I strengthen your argument?
Sure.
By simply adding the example that I know a little bit more about it. The regions where there is a higher, you know, where the institute is more and more madrasas, these are these Quran schools. You see the regressive effect. Huh? So because the fact is that the normal education is regressive, for example. So simply teaching people to read and assume that that can be disconnected from the actual ideas people are getting is absolutely, yeah, a non-starter. I think that you could do a complete set of empirical data on that, and I think it would become very obvious if you promote the unfreedom of women, for example, then obviously you will not get freedom of and equality of women. I mean, this is should be a fairly obvious
yes.
observation.
I agree. I agree. It matters what you read, not just learning how to read.
Yeah, this is.
Yeah, it matters a lot. Okay. In this slide, I want to show you, this is additional evidence. What Woodbury does in the first column is he takes all the variables that have been mentioned in the previous scholarly literature as helping to explain democratic institutions. So, for example, a dummy variable for a country being a former British colony. Researchers have noticed that countries that are former British colonies are more likely to have democratic institutions than, say, countries that are former French colonies. He runs the regression with all these variables that have been pointed out in the earlier literature as possibly being useful. And some of them turn out to be statistically significant. This is at the 1% level, 5% level, etc. Some of them turn out to be statistically significant. So, for example, other things being equal, if a country is a former British colony, because this is positive, it's more likely to have democratic institutions later in time. Other things being equal, if a country is landlocked, a landlocked nation, coefficient is negative, that means it's less likely to have democratic institutions later in time. If you're landlocked, it's harder for people to get to you. You're less likely to be influenced, less likely to have democratic institutions later in time. Okay, so you can look at this and draw a lot of conclusions, and they'd all be wrong. because in the second column, he runs the regression where he adds onto the list the 3 Protestant missionary variables, and notice what happens. 3 Protestant missionary variables, they all end up being positive, that's good, statistically significant at the 5% level, at the 1% level. So they all end up being positive and statistically significant. Furthermore, all the other variables, none of them are statistically significant. They all get wiped out, so to speak, in terms of being important. It's really striking. So what does this mean? It means it isn't actually important whether a country is a former British colony or not. It's only important how many Protestant missionaries showed up earlier in time. That's what really drives the democratic institutions. It doesn't really matter whether it's an island nation or not. It's how many Protestant missionaries showed up. And it just so happens that in the British colonies, it was easier for the Protestant missionaries to arrive. There were fewer restrictions that were placed on Protestant missionaries going to British colonies. So that's why you get this positive, statistically significant effect in the first regression. Once you control for the Protestant missionaries, statistically insignificant. Doesn't explain anything. Okay, so that's very nice. Next slide. Okay, in the next slide, column 2 is the same as what I showed you. In column 3, we add to the regression 2 more variables. Years exposed to Catholic missions and foreign Catholic priests per 10,000 population in the year 1923. Add those 2 variables, what happens? Statistically insignificant. Whereas the Protestant missionary variables continue to be statistically significant and positive. What does that mean? It means the Protestant missionaries are contributing to democratic institutions. The Catholic missionaries are having no effect on democratic institutions. That's very interesting. So it's not like everybody has an impact. It's more selective. And how do I explain that? My explanation is the Catholic missionaries, they set up schools too, but they tended to be aimed at the elites in colonial societies, educating the elites. Whereas the Protestant missionaries, they set up schools aiming at educating everybody that they could reach. And furthermore, the Protestant missionaries, they had a greater focus on everyone should read the Bible for themselves in their own language. This is pure conjecture, but this is how I interpret the results. So you don't have this positive impact with the Catholic missionaries that you do with the Protestants. So it's not like everybody shows up, helps promote democratic institutions. It's a stronger result than that. Next slide.
I have a question.
Sure.
Last point.
Let's go back.
I don't know if there has been done any research on this at all, but I find it hard to describe precisely, but has there ever been a, I'm not well versed enough into missiology to know that. Is there any correlation between the implicit political views of the Protestant and the implicit political views of the Catholic missionaries? I find it very hard to precisely describe, but is there any, I wouldn't know if there is any data or information or research on that at all.
Yeah, I don't know the answer, whether there is any research on that at all. Yes?
I'm sure that Woodbury distinguishes between Protestant missionaries who are independent and Protestant missionaries who are sent out by, for example, the British Empire in his research. And there you can see sort of a political bent towards preserving status quo or challenging unrighteousness, for example.
Yes. Yeah. But that still leaves the issue open. What about the Catholics?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure anybody has addressed this properly.
From my limited experience, I would guess, but I'm very careful here because I know that the picture can be globally very diverse. I would guess that the Catholic approach would be more sustaining status quo. But I am extremely careful to say that this is something that I assert or something like that. As I said, I think a missiologist should look into this. Actually, this should be done there should be missiologists looking at these numbers. I think.
Sure. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's the same regression as I showed before, with the 3 Protestant missionaries variables included. They're all highly statistically significant and positive. That's good. And all these other variables that have been suggested in earlier research as being potentially useful for explaining democratic institutions. Now, my point is that it could be that some of these other variables actually are important, would show up as statistically significant if some of the other variables were dropped from the regression. Just because there could be correlations between these variables that have the effect of wiping out statistical significance. So this is well known among researchers. If you drop some variables from a regression, some other variables could become statistically significant. And you can find out whether this occurs just by experimenting. Drop them. Rerun the regression, drop. See what happens. And it turns out one of these other variables is highly statistically significant when the other variables are dropped, and namely the dummy variable for Dutch colony. And it's statistically significant and negative, which is interesting. Woodbury has an explanation for why this would be the case. And his explanation, I find very plausible. His explanation was when Protestant missionaries went to colonies controlled by the Dutch, these Protestant missionaries were heavily regulated by the Dutch government in terms of what they could and could not do. So they were restricted. And thus, in those Dutch colonies, they're less likely to get democratic institutions later in time. Controlling for how many missionaries are present. The missionaries just don't have as big an impact in the Dutch colonies. It shows you the harmful effects of government regulation, or possibly harmful effects of government regulation. And this regression here, this is, so to speak, this is the best regression in the paper. It explains the most with the minimum number of variables, as a R-square of 0.5. So 50% of the variation in the data, it's nicely explained just by a few variables. Next slide. Yeah, okay. That's it for statistical analysis today. I don't want to overwhelm you, but I just think that these results are really exciting. Really exciting. And few people know about them, so I want to bring it to your attention. Yes?
Would these results be in any way published in the Swedish language?
They aren't right now. All I can say is I am teaching this material in my course at the Stockholm School of Economics.
I can also add, I can put this in Swedish. Vi på Svenska Evangeliska Alliansen har skrivit debattartiklar om protestantiska missionens bidrag till demokrati, och jag vet att även i andra sammanhang brukar man lyfta upp det här på olika sätt, men det är enbart sammanfattningar. forskningen har ju gjorts såklart och presenterat engelsk material, men man kan ju använda det här i egna föreläsningar, egna insändare, egna debattartiklar.
Okay. This slide is interesting because it's just looking at the raw data and noticing the pattern that you see when you group countries based on religion. Remember, Acemoglu and Robinson say religion is just not important for understanding the world we live in. So in this table, we actually look at religion. Just look at the raw data, and it's striking that the pattern strongly supports Woodbury's research. Woodbury's research is very careful statistical analysis. This is not careful. It's just looking at the raw data. But nevertheless, I find it interesting. When you do empirical work, you always look at the raw data first to see if there's something potential to explain, and then you study the issue more carefully. So the raw data, we group countries based on historically dominant religion. So for Protestant countries, that would include the United States, Germany, Sweden, UK, and a whole bunch of other countries I haven't listed. In total, that's a population of 530 million people. This is looking at the year 2002, when this analysis was done. And then for that group of countries, you can calculate average income per capita or per person GDP, gross domestic product. So standard measure economists use of average income. So it's usually we report average income for a country. But you can easily calculate it for a group of countries. And you get average income, $29,000 US. For Judaism, Jewish, there's just one country where the historically dominant religion is Judaism, Israel. It's just 6 million people, average income, 19,000. Catholic countries. We're looking at France, Italy, Spain, Brazil, and a whole bunch of others. In total, we're talking about a lot of people, 904 million people, average income, 9,000. And you go on, you go down the list. What strikes me is that the Protestant countries have had the best outcome, looking at the 2002 data, and it's much better than for other religious groups. In fact, if you compare the Protestant countries with Islam, you're comparing roughly 30,000 with 3,000. It's a tenfold difference, 10 times difference. If the average person living in a country where Islam is the historically dominant religion, the average person is very poor, shockingly poor. Yep.
Just a categorical comment there. Isn't it a bit unfair to compare? You should compare Islam with Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox. Or you should compare Protestant with Shia Islam or Sunni Islam because of the different strands within the Muslim faith. You could make the case for historical Christian countries to have a stronger stronger case on their side if you include Catholic and Orthodox together with the Protestant nations. If you then compare it to Islam.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, you certainly can do that. I'm just in the table.
Yeah,
they're just all divided up, but you can do the mental calculations of combining them pretty easily. And you do see that these Christian countries are getting much better outcomes, which is consistent with Woodbury's research. He's saying, the Protestant countries are in general countries where there have been more Protestant missionaries present earlier in time. I mean, that's why they became Protestant countries. So they've had the earlier influence of Protestant missionaries. They're more likely to have got democratic institutions. They're more likely to have got the benefits from democratic institutions. and have high average income. It's striking, the pattern that you just see in the raw data. Without doing any careful statistical analysis, you can see this. Okay, next slide. Okay, I move on to a different issue. I transition now. Next point I want to make. Reading the Bible promotes economic development. I've shown you the evidence, so it's not something, you've seen it. The Protestant countries where the Bible had the most influence shot up to become the most prosperous countries in the world. You have now seen the evidence. To understand how reading the Bible can promote economic development, one needs to read the Bible. We should be teaching the Bible in our secular universities if we want to understand what's really going on in the world. How's that for a provocative thought? And when reading the Bible, it's helpful to have a tour guide who can explain what the text means. Even Christians need a good tour guide. And I want to be provocative today and recommend a particular book which, for this issue, is a really good book. It's by Dennis Prager. It's called The Rational Bible Exodus. Came out last year, 2018. Fantastic book. What does he do? Dennis Prager, he takes the second book in the Bible, in the Old Testament, Exodus, second book of Moses. It's a commentary. It just goes verse by verse through the entire book of Exodus, explains what the text means. It's a very good educational experience for everyone in this room to read this book. And what I particularly like about this commentary is he makes a powerful case that the Bible is the basis of Western civilization. A really powerful case. Once you understand what the book of Exodus really means, every verse, you have a powerful case for you better understand why Woodbury is getting the regression results that he gets. Next slide. So I want to give you a taste of what's in the book. I'm going to be sort of a book salesman in the rest of today's talk, advertising what I think is a fantastic book. So here's what Prager writes in part of the book. The God who introduced the Torah is the first 5 books in the Old Testament, 5 books of Moses, Torah, began the long journey to belief in human equality solely as a result of the Torah statement that each of us is created in God's image. Slavery was abolished on a wide scale first in the Western world by Christians. This is not taught today in secular universities, but it's true. It was Christians who led the fight to abolish slavery in the Western world. By Christians who were rooted in the Torah and the rest of the Hebrew Bible, and who specifically cited the Torah doctrine that all human beings are created in God's image. And the verse we're talking about here is Genesis 1:27. Key verse. This is the very first time in Genesis that you have this message that all human beings are in some fundamental sense equal in dignity. And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. That's where it all begins in terms of this. That's the beginning of democratic institutions, basically, once you understand what's going on. Next slide. How does the Bible teach that slavery is wrong? Here's my answer. The central story in the first part of the Bible is about God delivering the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt, and then leading them into the Promised Land, a place where all agricultural land is privately owned. This latter is sort of a side point for today's talk. It's a side issue, but as an economics professor, I find it very fascinating that all land is privately owned in ancient Israel. And this is part of the Torah's instructions. So you don't have, the Torah does not promote socialism. For many people, reading the Bible is the first time they encounter the message that slavery is morally wrong, that God is against slavery. First time. For example, consider William Wilberforce. He lived from 1759 to 1833. The man who led the campaign to end slavery in Great Britain. The full story can be found in the biography by Eric Metaxas, published in 2007, Amazing Grace. Fantastic book. I highly recommend you read it to get a feel for what happened in the British Empire, how slavery actually came to be abolished. I give you a brief summary of this fantastic biography just to give you a flavor of what happened. William Wilberforce was born into one of the wealthiest families in Britain. He studied at Cambridge University. He was a gifted public speaker. He succeeded in getting elected to Parliament at the young age of 21 years old. So he's someone who's just very good at standing up and speaking without a script, just making up the words as he went along. And he could hold people's attention. So he had this natural talent. I don't have that talent. I need to have a script. But he was good at just speaking without a speechwriter. The issue of slavery had no interest for him. So studying at Cambridge University didn't do the job. He didn't come to the realization that slavery was wrong as a result of studying at Cambridge University. Had no interest for him until he had a conversion experience and became a Christian at age 26. So he's already in Parliament before he becomes a Christian. One needs to pay attention to what comes first, what comes second. To think about causation. He started to read the Bible on a regular basis, and soon he decided to devote his political life to the campaign to end slavery. In 1791, Wilberforce pushed a bill in the British Parliament calling for the abolition of the British slave trade, which is the transporting of black slaves from the African coast to the New World on British-owned ships. So he wasn't aiming for abolishing slavery. It was a step-by-step approach. First, let's try to abolish the slave trade. After a heated debate, the bill went down to defeat noes, 163, yes, 88. So you see that it wasn't obvious to people back then that slavery was wrong. He got outvoted overwhelmingly in Parliament, trying to abolish the British slave trade. It wasn't obvious to people at that time. Next slide. Wilberforce pushed the same bill year after year and continued to devote his energies to campaigning against slavery. It was a battle, and it took time to win the battle. The great victory occurred in 1807 when Wilberforce's bill finally passed Parliament. And this was basically after enough Christians got elected to Parliament. So you had to change who was in Parliament to change the outcome of the voting. And that takes time. The British slave trade had been abolished, 1807. Of course, slaves could still be transported from the African coast to the New World on ships from other countries, like France or Spain. And slavery was still legal in the British colonies, places like Jamaica. So slavery is still in the British Empire at that point. It's just the slave trade that has been abolished. Wilberforce continued to fight, and in 1833, on his deathbed, very end of his life, he received word of the very thing for which he had dreamed his entire adult life. The House of Parliament, had just passed a bill abolishing slavery everywhere in the British Empire. The West Indian planters would be compensated for approximately half the market value of their slaves. There needed, to get this passed, there needed to be financial compensation. People weren't voluntarily willing to give up a huge value in their ownership of slaves, so to get things through, one needed to make some compromises. Wilberforce said, "Thank God that I should have lived to witness a day in which England is willing to give 20 millions sterling for the abolition of slavery." Died 3 days later. What a story. Now I go back now to the quote I started off with, Acemoglu and Robinson, religion just isn't important. In Acemoglu and Robinson's book, I discovered, their book, Why Nations Fail, I discovered they talk about William Wilberforce. It's just one paragraph. It's really brief. They tell the reader that William Wilberforce was a charismatic personality and nothing about him being a Christian. That I think is leaving out something rather important in the story. Yeah, talk about misleading the general public in their history lecture. It's shameful. Next slide. I go back to Dennis Prager, his commentary on the book of Exodus, his great commentary. I want to show you what he has to say about this subject. He writes, "It is clear from the Exodus story that freedom is the desired human condition and should be fought for. Indeed, one of its great lessons is God wants humans to be free. This was the essential belief underlying the American Revolution. This is why oppressed groups in the West have so often used the Israelites' liberation from Egypt as their model for liberation. In the book Exodus and Revolution, the Princeton political philosopher Michael Walzer has made the case that the story of the Exodus, second book in the Bible, has inspired more movements of social change than any other story in literature." Next slide. I continue. How are we doing on time?
Good.
We have a little more time, but not so much.
5 minutes? Less?
I think 5
2 minutes. This will be my last slide. Last slide. I continue with Prager's book, just to give you a little bit more taste of what he has to say. He asks the question, do people prefer liberty or to be taken care of? And here's the verse where he's commenting on this issue, Exodus 16, verses 3 and 4, where it goes, "The Israelites said to them, 'If only we had died by the hands of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, when we ate our fill of bread.'" Life was so wonderful when we were slaves. "For you have brought us," you being Moses, "you have brought us out into this wilderness to starve this whole congregation to death." It's Moses' fault. Life was so good when we were slaves. This is what Prager writes as his commentary on the verses. "The Israelites draw an exaggerated idealized picture of the past. They longed to return to Egypt, not because the food was really as plentiful as they claim, but because as slaves, they did not have to provide for themselves. It is a myth people yearn most for freedom. Some people, thank God, do, but many, if not most people, prefer to be taken care of, even at the price of a loss of freedom, rather than to have to take care of themselves. That's it for my talk.